This is the story of how a book got born. It's the fall of 2018, and I'm up in New England, just wrapping up a little book tour for Poetry of Presence. The past few days, I've been staying in Amherst, Massachusetts, with my dear friend, the poet Pat Schneider, and her husband, Peter. Now, Pat I've known for a while, but Peter's new to me. I find him to be a sweet, brilliant fellow. With a PhD in theology, he's a philosopher at heart, a former United Methodist minister with a long history of deep community engagement. In his later years, he has largely devoted himself to supporting Pat and her work, both as a poet and as the founder and director of Amherst Writers and Artists. Maybe you've heard of that nonprofit. It has international reach. A year or so ago, Peter was diagnosed with dementia. According to Pat, when he got the news, he went at once to the attic and retrieved the old clarinet that he hadn't played since he was a boy, growing up in a musical family on a Wisconsin dairy farm. Ever since his diagnosis, he has rededicated himself to the instrument, practicing for hours every day, even taking weekly lessons in his home from a master clarinetist. Peter's music making has become, among other things, a way of anchoring himself in a world where he feels more and more disoriented. Though his personality remains intact, the dementia has robbed him of his short-term memory. It has shrunk to a mere 10 or 15 minutes. After that slice of time, his memory suddenly reboots and he can't remember what has just happened. He's living in a radical present, unable to track the immediate past or to plan ahead. So you can imagine that just out of simple curiosity, Peter is repeatedly asking me to reintroduce myself and to explain what has brought me to his home. I tell him over and over, and I begin to add two details. First, that just like him, I grew up on a farm in the Midwest. And second, just like him, I grew up playing the clarinet. After so many repetitions, Peter somehow begins to retain those two little details, though the matter of who I am and what I'm doing in his house remains for him a recurring mystery. Pat is utterly amazed by those two slender threads of continuity and by the affinity that starts to sprout between Peter and me based on that fuzzy familiarity. Peter's an excellent musician, but he's painfully shy. He'll only play his clarinet behind the closed door of his study. He doesn't seem to realize that in this centuries-old house, we can hear his music in every room. And it's delightful. It's also reassuring to Pat because wherever she is in the house, whatever she's doing, his music lets her know exactly where he is and what he's up to. Now, my last morning at the Schneiders, I noticed that the door of Peter's study is open just a crack. I sneak closer until I can see Peter playing his clarinet through that slight opening. Feeling something like a trespasser, I snap a picture of him with my smartphone, then tiptoe down the creaky hallway to Pat in the kitchen. I show her the photo. Tears flood her eyes. "Do you think," she asks me then, "that he might have left that door ajar on purpose?" Fast forward to evening of the same day. I'm at Boston Logan Airport, sitting in a dimly lit airplane on the tarmac, a night flight home. And I'm reflecting on the book tour and especially mulling over my stay with the Schneiders when a hot jolt of electricity shoots through me. That surge of energy melds a bit of Peter's story with two other story fragments to form what I recognize as the seed of a novel. One of those other two story fragments belongs to Darlene Renville Pipeboy. She's another friend, a Sasitawan Dakota elder from the Lake Traverse Reservation, a couple hours north of where I live. Her birth order name is Chekpawi. twin girl. Darlene has sometimes told me how, during her childhood in the 1940s, her parents had hidden her and her twin brother from reservation authorities who were intent on the twins attending a government boarding school. Over time, her recollections have piqued my curiosity about such schools, and I've started to read up on them. The boarding schools proliferated as the pace of American occupation and seizure of native lands picked up, as tribal nations were overpowered and forcibly confined to reservations, often far from their traditional homelands. The mission of these schools, undertaken in concert with a number of Protestant denominations as well as the Roman Catholic Church, was to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Those were the words of Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, a proud, quote, Indian killer who founded the first assimilationist boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The schools aimed to destroy the tribal identity of Native children and replace it with the culture, language, religion, livelihoods, and general worldview of the colonizing population, especially as represented in the rural lower class. The schools tried to brainwash the children not only to act white, but to serve white interests, all the while alienating the children from their own families, communities, and cultures. This map from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition shows the locations of 523 Indian boarding schools in the United States, as well as those of similar schools in Canada. This map is as of 2023. The number of schools is expected to grow as more information is gathered. 31 such schools operated in South Dakota, the state where I currently reside. Some of their locations are plotted here. Between 1879 and 1934, the U.S. government transported at least 830,000 Indigenous boys and girls to these schools, often after stealing them from their families. By 1900, 78% of all Native children had been sent to boarding schools. But this isn't just a matter of ancient history. 125 Indian boarding schools continue to operate today. We can only hope that they operate more humanely than they used to. Despite everything, the boarding school system did not, quote, kill the Indian. Native nations are still here, asserting their identity, their sovereignty, and their human rights. The final story fragment that fuses in this flash of inspiration on the airplane comes from my own family history. In this old family photo, my father's mother, Reva, is seated in the middle of the Findlay College Orchestra. By reputation, she was a fine violinist. Tragically, Grandma Reva took her own life when my dad was only 3 years old. In my observation, this loss and the manner in which it happened and the interpretation that my dad placed on it scarred Dad for life. He exhibited many of the classic symptoms of intergenerational trauma. Maybe the mother whose suicide had scarred him so deeply had herself been scarred. Maybe those scars had contributed to her depression and her decision to end her life. Who knows? But her suicide broke the hearts of her family. Once my father grew up and had a family of his own, he afflicted members of his own family with the effects of that old trauma without intending to, without even realizing he was doing it. Look again at Reva in this tiny orchestra, clad in pale clothing in the center of the stage, her violin across her lap. Now, look at this strikingly similar image, which I ran across during my casual reading about Indian boarding schools. This orchestra is from Genoa Indian School in Genoa, Nebraska. It was one of the largest off-reservation Indian boarding schools in the United States. It operated for 50 years, from 1884 to 1934. The school started as one building on 320 acres. It grew to over 30 buildings on 640 acres. Its peak enrollment was in 1932, shortly before it closed, with around 600 students. Over its history, Genoa Indian School was populated by children from 40 different tribal nations, including Darlene Renville Pipe Boys. Some children were only infants or toddlers when they arrived on campus. All were enrolled for a minimum of 3 years. At least 102 children died at the school, yes, of diseases like tuberculosis and influenza, but also of heart failure, accidental shootings, beatings, hangings, and other, quote, wounds to the neck. The total number of student deaths continues to rise as researchers collect and comb through official records. Efforts to find the school cemetery are ongoing. Now, at Genoa, as at most such schools, music touched every student. There were private music lessons, musicals and operettas, an all-male marching band that toured and even performed at world fairs, musical ensembles, choral, band, and orchestral concerts for enthusiastic audiences of local townspeople, bigwig politicians, and wealthy philanthropists. Genoa administrators insisted on a strict curriculum of classical music, martial music, and church music. In other words, white music. They intended music to serve as a powerful tool of assimilation, but the students had their own reasons for making music. They made music to express themselves, to honor the impulse toward music making they carried within them from their own peoples, to cope with homesickness, with an alien environment, with their struggle for identity, to forge connections across tribal boundaries, to gain praise, status, and recognition, to broaden their experience of the world as when they would go on tour. Some students made music as preparation for a livelihood. They went on to become music teachers within the federal Indian boarding school system. They toured the United States and Europe in professional bands, playing jazz, blues, and something that passed as Indian music for white concert goers who clamored for it. For 1 year at Genoa Indian School, the band and orchestra were led by James Riley Wheelock, an Oneida man from Wisconsin. He'd graduated from Carlisle Indian School, then traveled abroad to study and perform classical music in Europe. Returning home, he organized the United States Indian Band, a touring group that once appeared at Carnegie Hall. As an officer during World War I, he led an all-black regimental band that played martial music and jazz in the field for American troops heading for the front lines. He came to be known as the Indian Sousa or the Red Sousa. Wheelock once said, "Anyone who has ever heard my band play will testify that I have brought before the public a strong contradiction to that old saying that the only good Indian is a dead one, and proved that an Indian with proper training is capable of mastering the highest art, music. If he can prove himself an equal to his white brother in music, he can do anything, is what I preach. And to the best of my ability, I try to practice what I preach." James Riley Wheelock is a controversial figure in the landscape of American Indian music. If you want to know why I'm giving him special mention, you'll have to read the novel. For now, I'll just tell you that his instrument of choice was, like Peter Schneider's, the clarinet, a singing stick. Sitting on that airplane in Boston, I can't yet see the connection among these three strands of story that have bonded in my imagination: Peter Schneider's, Darlene Renville Pipe Boys, and Grandma Rebus. But there has to be a connection. In my creative life, hot energy spilling down my spine is an unmistakable signal that the muse is involved and that I'd better pay attention. Now, don't ask me to explain what I mean by the muse, because I can't, but I trust the muse. utterly. Now, the muse can be incredibly generous with flashes of inspiration pointing toward what must be done. But in my experience, the muse is a little slower to reveal why this thing must be done, let alone how. The why and the how emerge in their own way, in their own time, through the hard work that follows the muse's first visitation. So I get to work. And eventually, as I delve into my research and writing of this novel, the muse begins to show me what dementia, forced assimilation, as in the Indian boarding schools, and depression have in common. They all pose significant threats to a person's sense of identity, indeed to a person's very existence. And all of them can also lead to intergenerational trauma. Music making can be an anchor for us in the face of such threats. It's no guarantee of survival, of course, but it can be a help. Over the next few years, as I plunge deeper into my writing of this novel, the raw materials of those 3 story fragments begin to shapeshift and take on new flesh. They evolve into a unified work of fiction, a family saga. The main action takes place over a 24-hour period or so during the COVID pandemic, but the story stretches back to the early 1900s, just before another global pandemic, the Great Flu of 1918 to 1920. As I write, the themes of identity, intergenerational trauma and repair, and music form connective tissue in the narrative. Characters step forward and invite me to follow them into this fictional world. There's Simon Richter, a retired professor of paleontology who suffers from dementia. On his 80th birthday, he goes missing in a snowstorm along with his clarinet. There's his longtime wife, Fiona, Fee for short, a textile artist. She has been trying to keep Simon safe from both COVID and the effects of dementia. Now she's beside herself with worry because he's gone missing, and she has involved the police. There's their grown daughter, Abby, whose excavation of painful family secrets may have contributed to her father's disappearance. There's Vera, her father's long-dead mother, around whom those secrets revolve. There's a cast of minor characters who may not know each other, but are nevertheless bound up with each other, in part because of music. Perhaps, in a way, they are the music. Will Simon make his way home again? Will there be a happy ending to this story? I write on to find out, to learn the answers, to get from the what to the why and the how. In September 2024, at long last, The Singing Stick was published. Much has changed in the 5+ years since I started the novel. Pat and Peter Schneider are no longer with us. They perished during the COVID pandemic. Darlene Renville Pipeboy has also passed on. And this spring, just after I'd finished the novel's text, my mother unexpectedly descended into dementia. Her short-term memory is now shot, just like Simon Richter's. Her ability to express herself in words is severely impaired. Her delusions are constant and sometimes distressing. It now seems that one of the most important reasons behind my writing of this novel may be one I never could have foreseen on that airplane in Boston, or even while I was doing the work. Namely, I was writing it to prepare myself to love my mother through her own loss of identity. All that research I did into dementia, all that time I spent imagining my way into the character of Simon Richter, all that effort getting into the minds and hearts of his family and friends as they struggled to care for him, all of that work has brought me here to this work of loving my mother now as she is now. And I know that one way I'll go on loving her, even if she forgets who I am and why I am in the house of her life, will be by making music for her. Not long ago, I was on the phone with Mom, and she was babbling in the vast desert of her mind, where hardly anybody is who she believes them to be, and hardly anything is what it seems to be, and she can hardly say anything intelligible about any of it. And all of a sudden, she says to me, in a voice so clearly her own, "Is your new book out yet?" "Yes, Mom, it's out. The Singing Stick, God Itself Born. And I love you." If you would like to learn a little bit more about the Genoa Indian School, which figures so prominently in this novel, I would encourage you to capture this QR code on your phone, and it will take you to a 90-minute video of a panel discussion. The members of the panel are some of the most significant researchers into the Genoa Indian School today, and it's a great starting point. There are other resources about Genoa and about Indian boarding schools in general in the back of the novel. I hope that you'll check those out. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think of the novel after you read.